Thank you very much. It's really my extreme pleasure to be able to talk to Daniel Miller, a real legend in the music industry. I'm sure here everybody knows all the wonderful things he's done, from Depeche Mode to Richie Hawtin to Moby to plenty of other things. Trailblazing electronic music, without a doubt. How does it feel to be a trailblazer of electronic music?
It doesn't feel. It feels like the trail. The trail is the one. The only interesting trail the one I'm interested in is the one going forward, not the one going backwards.
Really, we're not allowed to look back at all.
Yeah, we can look back, but
okay.
but the trail is. What I'm focused on is the trail in front.
Right. Well, we'll get
I'm very
to that.
proud of the trail behind, but the one I'm focused on is the trail in front.
Well, you'll permit us to have a couple of minutes on the trail behind.
That's fine.
This
whatever
is
you want.
this is my personal thing. I really want to ask you about
sure.
discovering Depeche Mode. How did you feel when you first saw them, and were you aware that they were going to become a multi-platinum selling band, or how did that go?
Well, I first saw them play in 1980 in a small pub in the East End called the Bridge House. And they were supporting another artist on mute called Fad Gadget, who was the first artist on mute. And there were these four kids, and I just saw the sound check. They had like very cheap synthesizers balanced on beer crates, and they kind of had dodgy, new romantic kind of clothes on. I thought, wow. I saw a bit of the sound check, and I thought, wow, I'm going to stay and listen to this, because. Then they started their set, and it was the most incredible thing. Bearing in mind they were 17, 18-year-old at the time. Electronic music had just started to kind of cross over, become popular with people like Human League and so forth. But it was still quite an underground thing, and these were kids from a small town outside London called Basildon. But they'd grown up, the last couple of years, grown up with electronic music, and had decided not to become a conventional band. They decided to become an electronic band. And the thing about it was that the songs, you can imagine they're three monophonic synths with a little drum machine, and the songs were just amazing. And I thought, after the first song, I thought, oh well, they just probably play their best song first. It's going to go downhill, but it went uphill from there. I mean, got better from there. So that was it, really. And I just thought, these guys are incredible. I don't know what. There's something magical about them. These kids from the middle of, I won't say the middle of nowhere, that's an insult, but kind of the sticks, coming and playing these incredible really well-arranged electronic pop songs. And that was it, really. I went back. There wasn't really a backstage. I went to speak to them afterwards, and I said, would you like to put out a single? And they said, yeah, okay. We'll do a single. And I said, I'll just do one single, and if we get on, we can carry on from there. Did I think they were going to be a multi-platinum, stadium-filling, worldwide act 30 years later? Of course not. How could I see that? But I knew that they had a real potential to be a great a kind of experimental pop band.
Right, yeah, and certainly cutting edge at the time and even throughout their career.
Yeah, I think they've all, they certainly have especially Martin, who's now the main songwriter. He has a real keen interest in experimental music and techno especially, but all kinds of experimental music. And he really, really tries to bring that into the work. And I think that's what makes it very different from other artists working in that field, the kind of much more thoughtful, experimental end of things, sonically and in terms of arrangements and things, yeah.
Right. Great. Well, I could really talk about your career the entire time, but that's not what we're here for. So we're going to move forward, the trail forward.
Yeah.
So, as everybody in this room knows, that the sales of pre-recorded music has fallen off a cliff. There might be, some streaming income starting to come back, but essentially that income is nothing like it used to be in the heyday of the music industry. So the glaring question becomes, what are labels for? Do we need labels in this environment?
Well, when you say we, who do you mean? Who's we?
Well, the music industry.
I think it's not. I don't really care that much about the music industry, to be honest. I'm more interested in artists, and I think for some artists, it's really great to have a label home. It's a bit of a myth that when people say, well, these days, with the internet and everything, artists don't need labels anymore. The myth is not that they don't need labels. This has been going on for years. You know, when I started in 1978, I was an artist. I wasn't a record label. And I put out my own music, just the way people put out their own music now. I didn't want to be on a record label. I wanted to do it myself. So, and that was nearly 40 years ago. So the fact that it's somehow new that artists can put out their own music is a myth. That's always been an option. And when I talk to artists, if I'm interested in signing, I'd say, have you thought about putting it out yourselves? Because I think for some artists, that's a much better solution. And for some artists, it's a much better solution to be on a label, because if they want a creative relationship, if they want to focus on music and tour and record and not be doing the business side of things, I think that being on a label is one way of doing it. There are lots of ways. Some managers think that's not necessary, but we have very good relationships with the managers and the artists we work with, because we're part of a creative team that is all about reaching the artist's vision, meeting the artist's vision, their ambition musically and career-wise. So we will have a creative contribution to make to that.
Right, and
so the answer is, to your question, labels are good, but they're not needed, but there's still a role for labels, certainly, for artists. Yeah.
Right, yeah. I think I agree with that.
Yeah.
And so to push it in another direction artists can always put out their own music, especially in today's environment when they have so many platforms to do so. Mm-hmm. But what that leads to, as everyone knows, is that we have a real glut of people trying to promote their music. So perhaps then the role of the label is, as A&R, is to highlight the artists who really should be promoted.
Well, that's what I think our job is to find exceptional artists, and there are very, very few exceptional artists, because there are lots of very good artists now, but to stick your head up above that level is really hard, and you have to be absolutely exceptional to be able to do that. And so one of our roles is to find those artists, then it's to help develop their vision, Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's very competitive. People say it's easier now because of the internet. In some ways, it's much more difficult to get noticed,
Right. There's so much out there.
Yeah.
It's hard to get people's attention.
Yeah, exactly.
And one would hope that is exactly the role of the label, to highlight good artists, and people hopefully pay attention to that.
Well, that's what we try and do. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and for yourself, for your career, you were independent, then you were a major, and now you're independent again.
Yeah.
So how does it feel to be an independent again after 8 years, and what challenges come with that?
Well, it generally feels great to be independent. We were with EMI for 8 years, and some of those years were very good. But in the end, EMI had their own problems to deal with, and a lot of the consequences of that meant that us as a label were really kind of, I wouldn't say we weren't ignored for sure, but we found it more and more difficult to promote our artists through that system, because they were very focused on their own problems, which is fair enough. And of course they got sold, and then they got sold again in quite rapid succession. And that was around that time we decided, we had a mutual agreement between us and the Terra Firma, who were the company who owned it at the time. We parted company in a friendly way, I would say. Yeah.
Right.
And I think it became more and more bureaucratic, and more. I never had any real problems signing artists. It was more how long it took to sign the artists, and we lost a couple of those because it took so long, just because of the bureaucracy. And but it's great to be independent again. We kind of succeed or fail on our own decisions, not anybody else's decisions. So if something goes right, it's down to us, and if something goes wrong, it's down to us. And I feel much more happy with that situation, to be in that kind of control.
Right. And just quickly, what are the advantages or disadvantages of being independent?
The advantages are what I've just said. You make your own decisions. You can move much more quickly. You don't have so much money around sometimes, but then the money that you do have, you use, I think, more creatively. And we have worldwide distribution. There is not that much difference. We're just much smaller and much more agile.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Well, I want to get into this because I'm really curious for myself. We have a lot to talk about, but this is something I'm particularly curious for myself. So I hear there's some story from North Korea, which, as we all know, is a mystery territory. Nothing gets in or out, or very little gets in or out, and they don't really have participated in the world music industry. And you sort of, as a legendary music industry person, what were you doing in North Korea and what happened?
Well, roughly a year ago, one of the things that got into North Korea was one of our artists, a Slovenian band called Laibach. And they were the first Western rock, even though they wouldn't like to describe themselves as a Western rock band, because they're not from the West particularly, and they don't think it was rock. But they were the first Western rock band ever to play in North Korea.
Wow.
And we were there for about a week, and it was a remarkable experience. It was all organized by a Norwegian guy. Makes it even more, another level of surreality.
Right.
In North Korea, there's a committee called the Committee for Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries, and it does what it says. And there have been a number of exchanges between North Korea and European and other countries. And this guy, Morten Travik, he's an art curator and art director, and he'd built up a relationship and built up trust with these guys from the committee. He was also a collaborator of Laibach. He'd made videos with them and so forth. And he proposed this art project, which was to bring Laibach to North Korea. It was a 2-year process, I think at least 2-year process, to organize,
Wow.
to get everything agreed and organized. But by the time we got there, things were pretty smooth. I mean, there are still some issues around the creative side of what Laibach do. For instance, the lead, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the band, but the lead singer has a really dark, deep voice.
Right.
And when we started the sound check, he started singing, and one of the guys from the committee said, "This is the lead singer, bear in mind. Would it be possible if he didn't sing during the concert? we think he might be too scary for our audience."
Right, that's not possible.
And so, and there was a few amusing little things like that. And, of course, they censored some of the material, but that was all agreed up front. But the strange thing was that they provided some visual material for one of the shows, because the Laibach used a lot of visuals during their show, which we all agreed would work. They provided it, and then they censored that themselves as well.
They censored their own material.
They censored their own material, So, but within the context of North Korea, which is very specific, we were very well treated. They were very, very kind and very appreciative of what we did, and they were very proud to have us there. So,
wow.
It was. I still can't quite believe it happened, but it did happen.
Right. Can you tell me anything about the audience that were watching them? I mean, how did they respond, and how were they
The audience was mostly made up of invited guests. A lot of people from the music school. There's a very big music school in Pyongyang, which is 5,000 students. And this guy, Morten, already had a relationship with the music school. And actually, Laibach went on to do a couple of songs at the music school. So a lot of people from the music school were there. There was also the entire diplomatic community in North Korea from the West, or from the rest of the world. Because if you can imagine, in North Korea, not that much goes on. So whenever there's any kind of event, and I happened to be sitting next to the Syrian ambassador to North Korea, and we had a little nice little bit of chit-chat before the show. And then after about 5 minutes, he turned around to me and he said, "Oh my God, it's so loud. It's like torture."
You refrained from mentioning anything that was going on in his country.
Yeah, that's right. And the audience was very polite. They sat quietly and then applauded after each song in a very kind of,
Right, so it wasn't a raucous rock and roll show with people getting up and dancing.
No, there wasn't. They did a cover version, and Laibach are known for doing cover versions. They did a cover version of a famous Korean folk song, and as soon as they started playing that, you could see people getting more animated and more kind of a bit more, because they recognized it.
Right, they knew the melody.
Because they didn't know, they'd never heard Laibach before. They never heard a note before they arrived. They didn't know who they were. They didn't have any clue.
Right,
Right.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And did you feel it was successful overall?
It's successful in the sense that we got out, we got in, we performed, and we got out. Successful in the fact that we had a great time, or an interesting time, I should say. Whether it means anything at all within North Korea, culturally or musically, who knows? But I think the point is there's now been a band playing there. I think that, and so the doors are going to be slightly, and there was no problems. And so the door may be slightly nudged open. But I think there's a long way to go.
Yeah, but that's certainly fantastic that you're able to pull that off.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Asia in general. What are you guys doing in Asia? And then we can talk specifically more territories. But let's talk in general. Let's start with what are you guys doing in Asia right now?
Do you mean what am I doing here, or we're doing
No,
general?
I meant your company, your brand. We can. I think right now you're on stage at IMS.
Yeah.
So.
And I'm, yeah. Well, we do different. I mean, it's kind of hard to talk about Asia as a one entity.
Right.
I'm sure everybody knows it's so different between North Korea and Japan and China. You know, Japan's the most developed territory, and we've been working in Japan since the early '80s, and many of our artists have played there. And
Just out of curiosity, who are your partners in Japan?
well, our partners right now are a company called Traffic. They're a fairly small independent, and they're absolutely great. I think they're the best partners we've ever had.
Wow.
We've had our ups and downs in that country in terms of record sales and stuff, but Traffic are doing a really great job.
So I guess Ray Hearn will be really happy.
Yeah, Ray's involved with that.
Shout out to Ray Hearn.
Yeah, exactly. And in China, we've just started very tiny steps through an Englishman called Ed Pito, who's based in Beijing. Was actually about to be based in Berlin. But
Shout out to Ed Pito.
Shout out to Ed Pito. And I've known him for quite a few years. And when I came over last year, we just, we started to do just baby steps. And in other areas, we were with a company called Lovda for a lot of territories, so Hong Kong, Taiwan, and so forth.
Yep, I know well. They did well in Singapore for a while.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's quite hard for smaller artists to come and tour here just because it's expensive to get here, and it's expensive to travel, and the fees aren't so great for new artists.
Right.
Obviously, for established artists, if they want to come, they can, and often do. And the market's changing so much. Japan has changed. The international market share in Japan is right down to 12% now, I think.
Even less, perhaps.
Yeah, even less. But the other interesting part about Japan is still 80% physical, an 80% physical market, and vinyl's making a huge comeback there. HMV have a vinyl shop in Tokyo. So, all those things are really interesting, and,
Right. I mean, we could talk about Japan. I'm actually based in Tokyo, so
Yeah.
it's in a physical market, and it's really the traditional model of a music industry, physical market. CD stores, Tower Records has a 7-story CD store, and they have 60 more, well, probably 80 branches, and HMV has branches. Yeah, it's a whole different market. But let's talk about China. What are you guys, your company, trying to do in China now? What's your impression of how it's going?
Well, as I said, I think it's very early days for us in China. I mean, our music's available online, but I mean that doesn't mean anything really without people knowing it's there. And I think China, as I understand it, it's almost more important to build the brand of the label to start with a little bit. I think they did a very good job with 4AD, which I think is one of the highest profile independent labels in China.
Right.
And I think that's a model for us in a way, is to build a profile, just to come here more often. I mean, this is only my second time in China.
Oh, right.
So, and I definitely want to come back, and I want to bring some of our artists here and just develop it in that way. I just think I think that's the way for us to do it, because we're not a big pop label. We're not going to be relying on pop hits. It's more about artist development and developing small fan bases in certain places.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think this is really fertile ground, and we'll have more of a chance to talk about it when the whole panel joins us. So since we only have a few minutes left with the two of us, I want to ask you a couple more things, particularly the relationship between your musical work and your photographic work, if you don't mind sharing it with us.
Well, I've got two big hobbies, really. One is DJing, which is what I'm playing tonight, and the other one is photography. And what I'm interested in, I was asked by ADE, the Amsterdam Dance Event, because they knew I was into photography, to do a talk about photography and music. And I think they thought I was going to show pictures of Depeche Mode in the studio or controversial backstage shots and stuff like that.
Right.
But actually, that's not what I'm doing at all, and that's not really what interests me in particular. I'm really into street photography, which is candid photography in the street. It's around people. It's not about pictures of buildings. It's about people. It's about it's not portraits. It's about random moments when people come together, walking, shopping, whatever, finding those special moments. And I relate that a lot. And I'm also very into modular synthesis. And I really relate that to modular synthesis because, you know, in street photography, you can walk around the streets for hours and then you just get one moment that's right, and then that moment disappears.
Right.
And so it's about, and with modular synthesis, you can do exactly, you can play around forever, and you find a sound, and both that sound and that picture are unrepeatable because there are no memories.
Right.
And I think so. It's about the creative moment. It's about the creative process. It's understanding when it's right and what is the decisive moment, which is a very famous quote about street photography.
I was just going to what is that photographer's name, the French photographer?
Henri
said?
Cartier-Bresson.
Right, Cartier-Bresson said, the decisive moment.
You talk about and I think that they relate, so it's kind of, for me, the relationship is more about the creative process and when recognizing when things are good and when they're not good, and then capturing those things when they're good. So that's kind of more about what that's about.
Wow, there you go, the creative process. So you're not just a record producer, you're actually an artist yourself.
Well, you haven't seen my photographs. It's more about the process of taking the pictures.
I didn't say you were a good artist.
Yeah, exactly.
You're just an artist.
Yeah, of course.
I'm sure that's
yeah. No, I always say that. Just because you're an artist doesn't mean you're a good artist. That's one thing I say.
Well, on that note, I think I'd like to bring up the rest of the panel, assuming they're here. Oh, good, they're here. Let's bring up the rest of the panel. We have Michail Stangl from Boiler Room. Caralinda.
Hello.
How are you doing, darling?
Hello.
And Sam Wald from WME. Please, sit down. Caralinda Booth from Universal, our Universal consultant. Wow, I'm really honored to have such a great and diverse panel up here. And if I could ask you just to introduce yourselves so people here get to know what you do, then we can start the discussion on how labels can work with other entities in the industry to develop China. So can we start with Sam?
Yeah, hi, I'm Sam. I work at WME, which is a booking agency based out of our Sydney office. I book territorially through Asia-Pacific for our electronic roster.
Hello, my name is Michail Stangl. I am one of the people behind Boiler Room, where I lead both our Berlin operations and take care of most of our music strategy worldwide.
Great.
My name is Caralinda, and I've lived in China for about 12 years. I work as the A&R consultant for Universal Music in Beijing, and I also do quite a lot of work with independent Chinese artists as well.
Great, thank you so much. So I guess we can start with sort of the obvious point that in the old days, perhaps we could say it was really the labels, especially if they were a major label, that was sort of in charge of things, maybe in charge of an artist's career or at least artist development. And a lot of other people sort of followed their lead or took a secondary role, particularly perhaps the agent took a much more secondary role in the past, and that seems to have flipped around in the present day, and the agent is, let's say, very much more involved in developing an artist's career. So I'd like to ask maybe Sam about that, and other people can chip in on the label side as well. How involved is the agent in actually creating an artist's career, more than just doing bookings, but creating an artist's career? And we can get on to China after that.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think the agent's role in A&R has definitely changed over time. I mean, I think from a perspective of building out an artist's career, we often work in collaboration with the artist, with the manager, building long-term strategies, short-term strategies, but building touring platforms. But I think while the agent does work from the front end of it, we do work collaboratively with the label, work around releases, and I think that kind of fits into building a strategic plan. So, I mean, I think it's not touring for touring's sake, but it's touring with a purpose, which I think is the most important thing for building long-term long-term business for an artist.
Right, right. Maybe Daniel or Caralinda, either one of you could talk about that. Do you think the agent's role has changed? Have you seen that?
Yeah, I think the agent's role has changed a lot. The relationship between us as a label and the agent has always been a very important one for the reasons you said about for building a strategy, for building a career. It's always a bit slightly strange because the person who we don't, it's the manager who hires the agent. It's not the label. And there have been occasions over the years where the management has tried to keep us apart for some reason. I've never known why that was, and that's never been a very positive way of building the career. So for us, we want to, we're a team. It's the label, it's the publisher, it's the agent, the manager, the artist. They're all one team, but with one goal. And I think the more that we all work together and partner up, I think the better. I think it's really important.
Right, and you think that the agent's position has sort of risen since recorded music sales have fallen off?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for a lot of artists, not every artist, for a lot of artists, their main source of income is now live, not recorded music. And that's not across the board, but it's certainly for a lot. And I think from the managers, I think it's more not so much about agents, but it's more about the managers putting more and more emphasis on that, and sometimes losing the focus on how the artist makes the record and so forth. That their plan is more about the record marketing the tour than it used to be more about the tour marketing the record. And I think the best way of handling that is that they're kind of on an equal basis, that they work together, and that's when it works best. Not when one takes more priority over the other. When they work together, then everything grows.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe Caralinda can comment on the role of the agent in China, since it's probably a pretty special situation in China.
Well, it's a little different in China because the live scene is still a little bit, compared to what happens in outside of China, is not very developed. So, I mean, I work with some Chinese artists and they wouldn't even really understand what an agent did. That's one of the conversations I have quite often to explain.
You have to explain it to them,
between a promoter and a booking agent. But of course, as more agents get involved in what's happening over here and the live scene starts to develop, I'm sure that role will become more defined.
Right. Fantastic. Just from my own personal curiosity, so do agents play a big role in what you do in China, or probably not as much as in the West?
To be really honest with you, with developing an artist in mainland China, I haven't worked ever with an agent to do that particular course of action.
That's what I would have guessed.
When I take Chinese artists outside and I start saying, well, now we're going to build up your fan base in here, here, and here, of course, then it's a new conversation I'm having with artist managers from the mainland. This is your agent. They go, oh, what are they going to do? And I say, well, we need the agent to be part of the team. They work very closely with management, blah, 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 blah. So.
Right. So, I mean, if I could just follow up on that and also relate to a point that came out in an earlier panel, would that help you to bring a Chinese artist abroad? And if they can get some recognition outside of China, would that help build their profile inside the country?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, particularly because it's very tough to get a record deal, whether you're from whatever country. And so my thinking is, working with an agent is really important because it's part of your team. You can get the band building up their story, find their fan base. So yeah, management and agent, very important.
Right.
We must have some.
See that? I want to bring Michail in just for a second here. I think that for what you do, maybe the agents aren't as important, but I'm curious. Do you have a really strong relationship with agents, or?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, over the time that shifted a little bit. When we started doing what we did, a lot of agents were looking at us a little bit with curiosity and cautiousness, just because they could not. I'm not sure if everybody knows the model that we do, but we basically, in each city in that we broadcast from or that we go to document the music culture there, we usually do invite-only TV shows that are event, but also TV broadcasts. So we were considered by some agents because we were not really promoters. There was no money to be made with us, and because our business model does not allow this kind of approach working with artists. But over the years, we became a key supplier of content to the whole ecosystem of music, which means that a lot of agents approach us directly as part of their strategy and aiming at placing talent within Boiler Room shows, either in advance to have something that they can work with to promote an artist, or even as part of a tour if they come into markets where we are present, or yeah. So
Right.
we have, to be honest, we have a relationship with pretty much agents on every level, going from, you know, top people in LA to small techno booking agencies in Berlin. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that you bring up a good point. I kind of assumed everybody knew what you did, but your platform is really special and quite unique. So maybe you could explain exactly what your platform is, so we make sure everybody knows what it is, because it's not just a, you know, a club event.
So basically, in a nutshell, Boiler Room is an online TV station for underground electronic music. We started in a basement in London with a laptop and 2 webcams, and have grown over the past 6 years to an audience of about 160 million people a month, covering electronic music and all sorts of emerging music from all over the world. We've been so far in over 50 countries worldwide, with regular shows from Berlin, London, New York, LA, Tokyo, Mexico City, and Australia. The idea behind it is basically to build the most comprehensive archive of contemporary music culture, which means that we document it as it happens in a live environment, with a focus mostly on DJ and electronic music live set, but we also work a lot with jazz, classical music, rap, hip-hop, and other genres. So basically it's a part event brand, part online TV station for the internet generation, yeah.
Right.
And
right.
really underground, which means we've never worked with mainstream artists and have not really much intention to do so. So we gather up more music scenes all over the world into one huge audience.
Right. Sorry, I'm just gonna prod you a little bit, I think, because it's such an unusual platform, and I'm not sure how familiar people are with it. So that sounds fascinating. Would you mind explaining where your revenue stream is?
We have established, I mean, it's really, I mean, we face the same problem as most of the music industry, the unwillingness of consumers to pay for music. What we have established is basically, after, you know, not really, you must understand, when we started Boiler Room, it was more of an idea rather than a business. You know, it was growing always faster than we could as an organization. We were always running behind our momentum, and we were always way too small for what was happening around us. But what we have done quite successfully is aligning culture and the interests of brands who want to invest into culture, which means we found a way how to take really complex cultural narratives, which is usually what you'll find in underground music, and make them stay true to the core of those narratives, but allow brands to plug in, to access the audience, but also create value both for the brands and the audience, and ultimately also pay our bills. So this is we rely heavily on brand and selected very in-depth brand partnerships like Ray-Ban, Ballantine's, Budweiser. We did recently something with, yeah.
Right, right. I feel like that's really fertile ground in the new digital environment that we find ourselves in, but this panel is about label of love, so I'm going to draw it back to the labels. Maybe we can start with Caralinda, just in general, for a label to develop an artist in China. I mean, how difficult is that? What are the challenges, and how do you overcome them, and how would you compare it to doing so outside of China, which I think you know very well about as well?
Well, I have to be a little careful these days of discussing outside of China, because I lived in China such a long time, and things have changed since my day
Sure.
in the UK. What are the challenges? Well, I should qualify that question by the fact that the main label I work with is Universal, so that's in a way its own set of challenges, because it's a big international label, and a lot of the top artists from the mainland are actually not with the international labels, because they're coming up through the the sort of TV system of Pop Idol.
Right.
And so it's very aggressive. Once they win, you know, it's a very money-driven market. And for a label like Universal with such tight controls over the budgets, it's difficult for them to steam in and go, right, we're going to buy the winner.
Right.
So that's a very big challenge for the labels. The other thing is that with that constant thing that the big labels have, the balance between balancing the books and creativity, of course, there's a lot of very established artists from Taiwan and Hong Kong, you know, the old big giants.
Right.
So, of course, instinctively, when you're trying to keep the books balanced, it's easier in a way to put a lot of energy into keeping on rolling with your big players from Taiwan. So one of my challenges, because I was asked to specifically work with developing artists from the mainland, so that's been quite a challenge, you know, to get the marketing team's attention on my little baby artists when they've actually got to focus on the big boys coming in from Hong Kong or Taiwan, boys and girls.
Right.
So, I mean, I've been working at Universal a long time, and it goes in phases. At the moment, we're coming up to a very ripe phase again, because the companies, you know, they're earning more money from, say, the international market, so things are a little bit looser now, which means, of course, everyone's a bit more relaxed to invest in artist development. So, you know, this year there's some good signings coming up. It's still a little challenging, I have to be honest, to work at the real grassroots level,
Right.
developing the very young artists, because, well, you know. You know,
Well, we know,
it's a
but
constant
people out
battle.
there may not
And
know.
I've
So
always-
you can say it directly, yeah.
You know, it's still hard. So, what I try and do is the same as I guess still happens in outside of Asia, which I try and build up my grassroots artists. I build up their stories. I work with the managers. You know, we're trying to get it so I can then present it to the controllers in Universal and go, look at this artist. We've been working for a year. You know, we've got this much fan base digitally. They've put out some singles. They've got some stuff. So the same, I guess, as it's always been.
Right.
That's my sort of technique, and
Right.
to limited degrees of success in terms.
Sure.
But I'll just finish off in saying, but there was one artist that I had a lot of success with, which was broken through Universal through the very sort of a very non-typical mainland Chinese way. She had a hit record through the internet, and that was bubbling along, and then I managed to get her signed to Universal China, and it became the biggest song of 2012. So that was very satisfying because it was not plucking someone from the television route.
Right.
It was a bit more of an organic road.
Right. Just to clarify, I think there are probably a lot of people here from China, but maybe some people who are not so familiar with the Chinese environment, that they have a huge idol-driven culture now through TV programs like The Voice and other similar programs have become hugely popular in China, and winners of those competitions go on to be huge pop stars. Obviously, that's outside of the label system, that not necessarily outside of it, but fundamentally outside of it that Caralinda is talking about. So yeah, clearly that's a challenge. Maybe I'm going to throw it to Daniel now. How about you promoting or developing artists in China, or what is your experience anyway?
I don't really have any experience of developing artists in China, but I'm very interested in, especially on the underground dance scene. I believe I've met a few DJs now and producers from China that I'm interested in exploring, and who've been around for a while. Actually, they've also played in Europe. But as I said, this has been my second trip, and I've been here a couple of days. But I understand there's a really good, very young underground electronic music scene, which I'm really keen on exploring, and that's about as much as I can say, because that's really all I've done. But I think great music comes from everywhere, and so and I think from a country like China, which is culturally so different from the West, to hear what electronic music is like coming from China, I think for me is really interesting prospect, but I still have to do a lot of exploration about that.
Right. I mean, is that big in your plans to try and expand in China, or it's just something that interests you?
Well, expansion both ways. One is as a label into China, and one is to try and maybe find a Chinese artist or two. I think we're always looking for artists. We're always looking for exceptional artists. And my instinct tells me that there could be some really exceptional artists in China, simply because of the way they're approaching it from a Chinese perspective. I think could be very different from how a Western artist approaches it. So I think that's interesting, but I have a long way to go before I find something. And yeah, of course, we're always trying to expand our market in a country like China, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you're at the right place. I think Eric Zoe, who was on stage a couple of presentations before, was talking about how the underground scene is really blossoming here. And,
Yeah.
you know, he runs a very overground Storm EDM festival, which is, of course, related to IMS.
Yeah.
But there's a tremendous underground scene, which
Yeah.
is really blossoming, I would say, particularly in Shanghai.
Yeah.
So you'll have a good opportunity
Yeah.
to explore that.
Yeah, and I need to come back and spend more time.
That's probably
for
true
sure.
too. Yeah. Let me just ask Michail, do you have much of a direct relationship? I mean, you have such a unique platform that seems like it really would be a wonderful way to get promotion for artists. Do you have much of a relationship with labels in general, and then specifically in China? But let's talk about labels in general.
Okay, well, I mean, labels are if you talk about electronic music or underground electronic music or any kind of underground music, labels are incredibly important. I mean, they are key to both the storytelling of certain genres, they are key to aesthetic, they are key to identity. I mean, Mute Records is an incredibly good example of, you know, how a whole generation of music listeners can align on the aesthetic of one particular label. So for us as Boiler Room, working closely with labels is essential for multiple reasons. First of all, because we document music culture, which means that labels quite often represent either a certain city, a certain sound, a certain snapshot of culture, so we want to preserve that. On the other hand, they are of course also aggregators and facilitators, which means they allow us, you know, to from a logistical point of view, instead of talking with 5 different agents, artists, and managers, you know, we can do a lot of things through labels. This is also, when you look at Boiler Room's content, you'll find that not a majority, but a lot of our content are actually label-themed shows, which means that we quite often cover, you know, the stories of labels, you know. This is one of their more famous artists, one of the up-and-comers, with something historical. So this is very essential for us, just because it's embedded into the kind of music that we cover. When it comes to China, I mean, when we talk about Boiler Room's relationship to China, you know, we only start to, I mean, why we do what we do is basically because we want to open up audiences' ears worldwide to the beauty of music on a local level. You know, this is the strength of what we do. People come to see a Nina Kravitz, but they might leave with some Chinese electronic music. Ultimately, you know, what we do right now, okay, we've done now 3 shows here in China. Tonight will be the 4th. But ultimately, we want to build a platform here in China which is also driven by the Chinese underground electronic music scene, so it can showcase itself. You know, it's not going to be Boiler Room coming from Berlin to showcase what's relevant in China, because whatever my opinion of that is very tiny and very limited, because I'm not on the ground. Ultimately, our goal is that we establish an infrastructure that will have a platform that works actually as a platform for Chinese electronic music to showcase themselves into the world. And immediately when we came to China, one of the key relationships we established with a couple of smaller underground music labels like Do Hits, like Subcult, who were essential in kind of helping us to understand what's happening here and where we should point our attention to. So when in underground music, it does not work without labels, just because that's yeah, it just doesn't work.
Right. I mean, I think that maybe I've been using the term a little bit too generally. Of course, you have major labels like Caralinda works for, and then you're working with very small underground labels in Shanghai or in Beijing. I guess you wouldn't be working with underground labels in any cities outside of those 2.
We just have not, some of the artists are positioned around on mainland China, but we ourselves have not been yet anywhere else, even though that soon is going to happen, yeah.
I was going to say something about that, actually. I do think that everyone forgets there is a lot of stuff happening outside of Beijing and Shanghai, and in some cases maybe you know, it's a little easier for the new underground music scene to be flourishing in particularly Beijing, which is quite a tough environment, you know, it's for the reasons we all know about. So let's not forget about what's happening, you know,
Sure, sure. China is a
stuff going
gigantic
on.
country, and as Eric was also talking about, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 cities. But I think that, yeah, for the artist to get any kind of international or let even say national recognition, it's got to maintain some popularity in at least some of the tier 1 cities. It can come from the tier 3 city or the tier 4 city, but if you're not playing gigs in Shanghai or Beijing, then almost no one will know about you in China.
I mean, also for us, it was very important from the beginning on to focus on labels, is because, you know, audiences, of course, we are really plugged in. You know, we're all music professionals. We know how certain markets look like, but audiences and music fans are, you know, quite spread out in their interests. So for us, what we started immediately to cover labels was one of the reasons, because we wanted to know, to show that there is this infrastructure, you know, that it's not just something that recently started, but this electronic music has been around in China for so long, that there are crews that are established, that's been around for decades, that have already a back catalog of 20, 30 releases, and from there on you build the story of, or you tell that story of a whole country and its music. So this is one of the strategic reasonings why we started immediately to work with labels and also put a focus on them rather than just pick a few artists and not mention what's around them.
Right. I wanted to ask you, because my experience of Boiler Room, my understanding of it is that you're basically broadcasting a show. But you were saying you focused on a label, I mean, but you don't do any sort of documentary work around the label, do you?
Well, we do that when we work with brand partners. That allows us then to, you know, commit time and work to do other content. We do that as, of course. What I meant with it is, you know, when we two small details, you know, when you talk about the social media kind of around the show, you know, the wording, the copy, that you focus it more on, here's this artist from this collective, and you repeat that so people click also on the collective, and that the collective gets exposure. So this is just to know in what environment that artist moves, and also to put focus on it. That was more what we do. We did not shoot a documentary yet about what's happening here, but of course that's hopefully happening in the near future.
Oh, so you have some plans to
Yeah,
possibly
of course,
do that?
of course, of
I
course.
see. Right. Well, I want to bring Sam in. You have a really deep experience booking artists around a region, both in the context of labels and even outside of the context of labels. Can you compare booking artists? I mean, obviously there's territories which are very developed, like Japan, and then there's China, which is very much a developing music market. Can you talk about booking artists in the different territories and what the different experiences are?
Yeah, I mean, from what I do day to day in booking mostly electronic artists, I think it's, you know, about generating, you know, there's club culture in each market that's different, and there's, you know, through social media, through different platforms to how markets are introduced to music, it's kind of generates the sounds. And I think each market has sort of different subcultures, obviously. But I think the way that we work directly with labels is we utilize labels because they are on the ground. They do have that sort of innate understanding of how the market works day to day, and you know, you do work together in terms of kind of figuring out how an artist strategy coming in and out of each market can be amplified by how the label can support it, how the artist can support it through their social media, and how everyone can kind of work together. We also rely on, you know, strong promoter relationships as well, which I think is incredibly important in Asia specifically, where there, you know, it is a new and emerging market relative to the Western world, and I think it's important to develop those strong promoter relationships, creating artist growth long term.
Sure, sure. I mean, it might be a little bit difficult, or perhaps, you know, bookings in China are quite more scarce compared to other territories. But can you talk about booking artists? I mean, is it more difficult? That's just my impression, that it's really difficult to book artists in China. There's so many moving pieces, and it's hard to know, you know, whom to trust. Obviously, you develop relationships with people.
I mean, I don't think it's so much that it's difficult. I mean, I think there are definitely hurdles with any market, but I mean, I think because it is, in certain senses, a more insular market socially. The same things that are, beneficial to artists in the Western world you might not have access to within China. So I think it's important about the artists being aware and the management being aware of why there's derived value on the artist and where fans are becoming, how fans are becoming educated about specific artists. So I don't think it's necessarily any more difficult. I just think there's different challenges to promoting artists and to booking artists into China.
Right. You have something to say, Caralinda?
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties actually that I find, which you may or may not agree, is that the whole idea of building up an artist's career through live shows is not so commonplace here. It hasn't been part of the sort of structure of building your artist. And so what I found is the notion of a live show is all about earning money. So it's a bit more difficult, that whole idea of, well, you're going to put her out on the road or him out on the road, and this tour has, but maybe you're going to even lose money. That's been met with horror.
Right,
It's sort of
right.
people are getting a bit more used to that idea, but traditionally, if you go deeper into, not probably in the underground, but in the sort of more mainstream world, it's all, putting on a live show is definitely about earning some big dosh.
Right.
So I think.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with you on that point. I think it's also relevant to what every artist's ultimate goal is. If they want to develop, it is going to be, there are risks involved, there are financial risks, and it's definitely not cheap coming across to China or to Asia, generally speaking. Geographically, it's tough to get to for some of the artists, but I think if you do spend the time early on, if you do work hard in developing the market and you utilize your time on ground, the shows supplement what you can do on ground through promotion, through other avenues. I think the short-term losses, hopefully, can be overcome in the long term, but I do agree. Financially, it is risky, and there are those.
Yeah, I was talking more about Chinese artists, actually, rather than the visiting artists. I was talking about, the booking Chinese artists locally.
Oh, right.
And that whole side of things, it's quite
Sure.
difficult.
I also think that it's a question of if there's going to be a loss on the tour, who's going to cover that loss? Because traditionally, that's been the record company. And as you said, the balance has gone very much from the label in terms of the financial side, from the label to agents and promoters. But I haven't noticed agents and promoters yet investing in those losses, which I think is something that's going to have to be addressed at a certain point as well.
That's the tension, right?
Yeah.
The interesting
look of horror on Sam's face.
The interesting thing is again, Boiler Room is a little bit external from this conversation, but the interesting feedback that we've got from the artists that participated in our first shows in China, which by the way were an immense success. We had 3.5 million live viewers on the first two shows only in China alone, which made it the biggest showcase of electronic music up to date in China. And thanks to our media partner here in China, which is Le TV, which probably most of you know.
When was that?
That was in May, 1st of May.
Wow.
But the feedback that we got from, and this is the beauty of our platform and that's why we do it and why we want to do it, and which I hope more and more artists will be able to utilize in the future, is feedback from the local artists was after they performed on Boiler Room, they got recognition feedback and requests from cities in China where they did not even know that they had an audience.
Right.
Which is on one hand quite often the effect that when we go into a country, we put on local talent, they get recognition finally in their own country because they are perceived then as more relevant. And plus the other chance, which plays a little bit into what Sam says, is that since it's hard to tour for foreign artists here in China, we hope that we can become a little bit of a digital kind of hub for artists that might not be able to play a real gig, but might be able to play a Boiler Room and then have content that will grow their profile within China. So it's, yeah, well, we hope that we'll be able to grow both, especially the local scene, but also, of course, support all of our partners internationally to be able to represent themselves here in China.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of a, I hesitate to use the word substitute, but it's kind of a good alternative if an artist can't afford to tour in China, that they can use your platform and get exposure that way.
And the same goes now exactly to got back to the labels. I mean, this is also what we want to help the labels with. This is our focus of music labels, that on the music labels, that they, you know, their work, their aesthetic, and their collectives, you know, are perceived as one and have the same kind. Even though one thing that I completely am not aware of is how they monetize the few underground labels that are here, how they monetize their music within China. So if there's any way how, you know, that can be supported, this is something that we probably have to look into.
Right.
Because in Europe it's easy, you know, then the new record out, go to Boomcat, buy it. So done deal. Here it's a little bit different.
Yeah, well, maybe we can ask Caralinda that. I have my own thoughts, but maybe just off the bat, how can an artist monetize their music in China?
An independent?
Well, you could ask for both perspectives, independent and major.
An independent artist, I think it's really hard. I mean, I guess in independent world it's brand opportunities. Sort of probably it. I don't know. I don't think it's very easy to gather income from digital if you're independent.
Well, I mean, that's a big question. I really wish we had somebody from streaming. I did a panel with Andy Ung, who's the GM of QQ Music down at Music Matters in Singapore, and he said they have over 10 million paid subscribers on QQ, and of course I think that they're even second. I think Google may actually have more than that. So there's a lot of people paying for music subscriptions in China. Now, how much of that money is filtering back to the rights holders? That's always a question for streaming, so we don't know, but hopefully some of it is filtering back and the artists are getting some of it.
Yeah.
Michail, or
I mean, I have to be honest, I've never had an independent Chinese artist come to me and say, yeah, no, I've got a nice check-in from
hopefully
never.
that starts this year. Well, Michail, you look like you had some comment on that, or no? Okay. Do you work with the streaming services at all, or it's not really a relationship that you develop?
At the moment, I mean, Spotify and Apple just both implemented technology that allows them to feature DJ sets. So they're gonna build on that quite soon. So I hope that we'll be able to, I mean, we have right now some ridiculous 400,000 minutes of DJ sets. So we have a lot of content to offer. Yeah.
Right. Wow, that's a lot. Well, I want to summarize one of the things that was said before, because I think it's a really important insight. Traditionally, concerts and touring was used as a way to promote the music to recorded sales, since that has fallen away, and now touring is the primary income stream. That if there's a loss, or, you know, who puts up the money for that has become a big question, and I think that question hangs in the air. I don't think that there's any answer to that right now, and that's a question that all of us as an industry together are going to have to answer and maybe figure out a new way of doing things. I just want to ask you again, Caralinda, because you're the expert on China here. I think, well, on this stage you certainly are, that to develop an artist in China, I think it's really difficult, major or independent. I mean, I'm just not aware of artist development where it's gone from a small person to being a major. I mean, there's The Voice and all those things, but a label development, label A&R. Can you make a superstar in China? Is that really something that a label still has the power to do?
Well, of course I have to have the dream
Right.
that we're going to make a superstar in China. And it's not going to be a pop idol. You know, my dream is that we're going to find whatever genre of music it comes from. We're going to create and help, you know, more Chinese artists to come through. And of course, break internationally as well. Is it hard? I mean, it's hard anywhere.
Right.
I mean, one of my old mentors in the UK said to me, you know, 99% of the artists aren't going to make it, and of that 1%, 99% won't make it. So, I mean, I think one thing is that, you know, of course, the old A&R criteria, it works everywhere, you know, and as much as being talented, you've also got to really want it. because it's really hard work.
Right,
You don't
right.
really have a life for like 10 years. You know?
Right.
And would you agree with that?
More than 10 years, yeah.
But so you've really got to want that. And,
Yeah.
and
I think even more today, you know, there's no room for slackers, you know, to be honest. You really have to work, as an artist and as a label, both have to really be committed and have the passion and really want it. Because otherwise, it just isn't going to work, you know.
I agree, and I mean, one of my constant mantras actually is investment in artist development, and it is difficult in China to get people to invest in artist development. I don't know if it's even more difficult. I'm sure it's hard in every other country in the world, but you know, because it's risky. Someone said to me, I said, well, if you put this much money into artist development and we can sign, you know, 6 new young artists, and they said, well, how do you know they're going to become famous? And I said, well, I can't guarantee that. Well, why do you want us to spend the money? Well, you just got to go for it. You know, you've got to trust it. And
Right.
I do struggle with that a little bit here, but I'm sure there's many people who'd struggle with that in any country.
I mean, but in the end, that's if people want to be in the music business, if you just play it safe in the music business, it'll die.
Absolutely.
And so the people who take risks are the ones who survive, and the ones who don't may make a lot of money, but they don't make any contribution to the culture. And in the end, they die because they're not really moving forward. You know.
Well, also the most riskiest decisions about artists, I think, ultimately make the most long-term profitable artists. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
risky is good.
Well, it's a risk, you know, it has to be. You know, I don't think of it as a risk, actually. If I thought of it as risk, I think I might be a bit more scared, but I don't think of it as risk. I just think it as kind of a way of life.
Adventure.
You know? Yeah, adventure rather than risk. Thank
Right.
you, yeah.
Adventure's a good word.
Yeah.
Michail, you had something you wanted to add?
Well, one of the points that we maybe did not touch on, but that's also very important for us as an external, you know, platform that ultimately Chinese labels would want to be present on is, of course, you have a little bit at the moment, adaptability problems with the platforms that are important for our audience and the platforms that are present here. And basically, for us to be successful in promoting Chinese labels and Chinese artists worldwide, they need to be present, and what's relevant for the music audiences outside of China, and that is at the moment really not the case. So I was actually sitting just now before the panel preparing all of our social media for tonight's show, and a few of the artists are not even present on the platform, which means that I will not be able to drive a lot of this attention, this ridiculous millions of people who will watch tonight.
Right.
Anywhere really, because they are not present on those platforms.
I think the same can be said from a touring perspective, which I touched on earlier, where an artist which might have a certain profile outside of the region doesn't have the same profile here because they don't have access to the same social media platforms, and it is a hurdle for artists to be exported in, but I think also exporting out,
Right.
importing in rather.
Right. To give people a takeaway from this conversation right here, which I think is very important as we're talking about labels, is that from my perspective, traditionally what a label did was very defined, and it also, you know, wasn't really that high pressure. You know, you did a media buy, you got it on the radio stations, and that was sort of your job. If you're going to be a successful label, particularly a successful independent label in this environment that we have now in the music industry, you're going to have to hustle. You're going to have to be working on so many different platforms and in so many different ways simultaneously to promote your artist in an environment which is incredibly crowded with so many different artists that, you know, as Daniel was just talking about, it's, you know, get into it or get out of it. There's no half measures anymore. You have to work extremely hard and be on it at all times because there's always more you could be doing. And I don't feel in the past that was the case, but now it is.
I always felt there was always more to be done.
Right.
But I mean, maybe there's even more to be done now. Okay.
Right. There's just so many different platforms now. Go ahead, Michail.
No, this is the challenge, especially I guess then for Chinese artists and labels, because it's quite complex already within China with a lot of like multiple bigger platforms that you need to cater to, but then you also have to pay attention to what's happening in a market that you're not present. It's the same thing for us. I need to know on which platforms I need to be present as Boiler Room, so the Chinese audience knows of us. But I guess it's a really, really big challenge, especially if you do it independently and you have to crack shifts in a day job, and then you have to maintain an evening 25 different platforms, of which 10 are in a language that you probably not really know really well.
Right, right.
So that's a business opportunity for somebody out there, I guess.
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a tremendous number of opportunities to, manage platforms for doing them in different languages, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of new, software and startups which we're kind of coming about to do exactly that. We only have a few minutes left. I want to throw it out to the audience, see if anybody has any questions. We have an incredibly diverse lineup of people on stage from all sectors of the music industry. Do we have any questions out there?
Yeah, there's one over there. Behind the camera.
Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to address the promoter agent tour support point that was raised. Actually, I think it's debatable whether DJs need tour support in the way that bands do, because DJ culture tends to monetize DJs quite early in their career. But in terms of bands, actually there's a very active conversation that's been going on for some years. Both Live Nation and AEG have programs in place now for basically doing what are called earn-out deals. And they're going to agents and managers and young artists and giving them the opportunity to basically pre-sell their touring rights to them in exchange for large advances. And those advances help put them on the road. There are probably, a few dozens of those deals in place. It will be hundreds over the next few years. Other promoters are actively pursuing the same thing. And I think it will become a fairly common trend in the future, because agents and promoters do recognize that the tour support issue has to be filled. Also, I think you have to give credit to the Red Bulls of this world, where they have financially invested in artists and given them the same opportunity. So I think between brands and the larger conglomerate promoters, I think that issue is actually going to get addressed. It's just going to take time, obviously.
Wow, well, thank you for the insight. Do you have a question at all?
Yeah, I missed it earlier, so apologies if it was covered. But Michail, have you actually asked your subscribers to your followers to subscribe? You said that people are unwilling to subscribe to music, but Apple have 40 million subscribers, I believe. Spotify have 10 million. There's somebody just said the Chinese system has 10 million. Have you actually asked your customers, would they be willing to fund your service so that people can receive their royalties?
We have not thought in the past. I mean, we thought about paywalls in the past, but I believe that what we've set out to will not, like the core of Boiler Room, which is documenting, making music accessible and ultimately democratizing music culture, cannot work if we, make people pay for it for this exploration part. If it's, if we talk premium content some point down the road, that is probably the way to go for us. But for what we do at the moment, I don't think it's smart nor fair towards both the artists that we give access to the audience and the audience. Yeah.
If you ever achieve a joint venture with someone like Apple, as you implied just now, will you retroactively pay people the publishing for what's been broadcast?
I unfortunately am not very knowledgeable about publishing. I take care more of I'm the person who points at the cool guys, and somebody else makes the contracts, unfortunately.
Great, thank you very much.
In an ideal world, you would pay out at every point. But for example, at the moment when we talk about, production costs, to do a Boiler Room show that costs 4 figures per show, and we invest heavily into, I was actually the other day in New York with like some VC billionaire, and I found out, basically understood that our model is not unsimilar from VC investment. We cover 1,000 artists without even knowing if any of them will ever make it to stardom. But some do, even though our goal is to cover those 1,000 artists and not to hope for 100 breaking through. But the idea is kind of basically similar, yeah.
Thank you. I think we have another question right here.
Hi, this question's really for Daniel. I'm Jody Taylor, CEO of Right Rhythm. We are a service dedicated to connecting producers and indie record labels together. I would say across the board, both artists and record labels, there are certain big acts that are at the top of the podium that haven't released anything in 5 to 10 years, and they're still riding out their career. They're getting all the gigs, all the exposure that all the up-and-coming producers that are amazing, that are producing things that are, production quality is way better now than it was before, and it's just still not getting the legroom. Even though that they're signed to these record labels, and sure, they might not be really, really big indie labels, but they're trying, they're sending out promos, they're talking to everybody. They might not have the best industry connections as opposed to these guys that I was saying. And this also includes record labels as well. There's some labels out there that are still riding off of their one hit, etc. So my question is, what can a label or an artist or both do in this day and age to break through that and potentially get the respect and the chance to be at the podium as they should be?
Well, I think it depends slightly. Are you talking from a Chinese perspective or a European or American, or just a general perspective?
In a general perspective, but European market would be best.
I mean, I think that, you talk about established artists kind of maybe taking up too much space in the media world. I don't see that, actually. I almost see a reaction against the very large kind of artists from the last 20 years. I think a lot of festivals, and I'm sure there are people in this room who are much more better qualified than me to comment on that, but for instance, in festivals, they have a hard time finding headliners that really mean something anymore. And it's really just like 4 or 5 artists that really, can bring the kind of gravitas to a festival. And in the UK, for instance, on the Radio 1 would never feature an artist who's been around more than 3 years. So I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing. It's not necessarily a good thing for us as a label, because some of our artists have been around a bit longer. But they are actively trying to promote new things. I think it's not so much about the kind of the traffic at the top end of the market. I think that is problematic. I think it's the general traffic throughout there's just so much music out there. That's what we talked about a little bit before. There's so much music. I think how to break through I don't have an answer for that. If I had an answer for that, I'd be too busy working it out in the office.
Breaking through.
But artists do break through, and they break through for different reasons. But in the end, the music, especially if you're not working pop, there's a pure pop end of music, which is very different to the kind of area that I'm working in. And I think in the area I'm working in, it's about, you have to be exceptional as an artist. There's so many really good artists, but there are millions of really good artists. You have to be exceptional, and you have to work exceptionally hard and have an incredibly strong vision and ambition to make it work. There's no answer.
And a bit of luck.
Thank you.
And a lot of luck. Yeah, luck. Thank you. Luck is really important.
Yeah.
Right time, right place. Yeah.
The question was directed to
And
Daniel,
money.
but Michail, you want to say something?
Well, and you have to have money, because one of the challenges is, especially for underground music, as you just said, who foots the bill for developing a career. If you talk about artists that come from, Western Europe, who probably also either have support, of their peers, their family, or just earn more at doing what they do besides music, then it's easy. One thing that I do in Berlin is running a festival for more like experimental avant-garde music, and one of the things we do is support artists from countries that are not Eurocentric, just because a lot of those artists just cannot afford just to gather up 800, 900, 1,500 euros to come to Europe and then just try to tour and then be like, okay, this first tour didn't work out, let's see how the next one works. There's a huge barrier to that the music industry in Europe especially did not address and does not particularly care about, frankly speaking. So this is one of the other challenges.
Right, more on the underground or experimental aspect.
For pretty much everyone.
Right. I think we have time for one last question, if there's one more question out there. You have a great opportunity here to talk to extremely diverse way over there on the right.
Hi there. Just addressing what you guys said about there being like not too many creative ways that people can sort of earn, I suppose, or monetize their talent. Recently, we were involved in a online busking festival, which we did in March in Australia, which sort of was broadcast around the world. We had like 18 artists from around the world, and they were all sort of staging themselves, and it was a tipping model where online audiences were tipping the artists, and it's kind of like empowering the artists in a way. That was called Laibach. It was a charity event, but they're actually the guys that did it. They're doing it commercially as well. There's also like Bandcamp, which you may have heard of, which is like a direct way to connect artists to their audiences and stuff like that. So there are ways out there to, you know,
Right,
connect.
for sure. There's a lot of alternative revenue streams out there. Did you have a question, or you just wanted to point that out?
I just wanted to say that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, I really want to thank my excellent panel. I really enjoyed the conversation. Give them a hand. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.